Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975. Decades before smartphones existed, before anyone carried a camera in their pocket, one of Kodak's own engineers built the technology that would eventually destroy the company. Then, Kodak spent years protecting its film business instead of chasing it. This is one of the strangest stories in business history, and it's not really about missing the future. It's about what happens when a company's own success becomes its biggest liability. Let's start with the invention itself. Engineer Sasson built the first working digital camera prototype while working at Kodak. It was toaster-sized, held together with spare parts, and it captured black and white images onto a cassette tape. By today's standards, it looks like a toy. In 1975, it was a working proof that photography could exist without film, without chemicals, and without a darkroom. When Sasson showed the prototype to Kodak executives, the reaction wasn't excitement. It was concern. Think about what that means for a second. A company's own engineer walks into a room holding the future, and the people in charge look worried instead of thrilled. That single reaction tells you almost everything you need to know about how large, profitable organizations actually behave when threatened from the inside. Here's why the concern made a strange kind of sense. Digital photography threatened Kodak's entire existing business, a business built almost entirely around selling film, chemicals, and photo paper. That business was generating enormous, reliable profit margins, and had been doing so for decades. Kodak wasn't a struggling company looking for its next big idea. It was a dominant, cash-generating machine with a business model that worked extremely well, right up until the moment it didn't. This is the mechanism worth sitting with, because it's the part most retellings of this story skip past. It is not that Kodak's leadership failed to see digital photography coming. Sasson's prototype proves they saw it, years ahead of almost anyone else on Earth. The failure wasn't a failure of foresight. It was a failure of incentives. Every manager inside Kodak was being measured, promoted, and rewarded based on the performance of the film business. Nobody's bonus depended on how fast the company cannibalized its own cash cow. So, quarter after quarter, the rational individual decision was to protect what already worked and treat the new technology as a slow-moving, distant risk rather than an urgent priority. Rather than aggressively developing the technology, Kodak treated it as a slow-moving future risk. It patented pieces of the innovation defensively, which is its own kind of tell. Defensive patenting is what a company does when it wants to own an idea without actually building it. It's insurance, not commitment. Meanwhile, Kodak continued to prioritize film sales internally because that's where the money and the internal power actually were. For years, this approach actually worked, financially speaking. Film remained massively profitable well into the 1990s, which made the eventual threat feel distant and easy to avoid. This is worth emphasizing, because it explains why so many smart people inside Kodak went along with the strategy. It wasn't obviously wrong at the time. The numbers on the quarterly report kept looking fine. When the thing you're supposed to be worried about isn't yet showing up in this quarter's results, it's remarkably easy to keep deferring the hard decision to next year and the year after that. This pattern has a name in psychology and behavioral economics. Several names, actually, and it's worth walking through them because understanding the mechanism is what makes the lesson usable, instead of just a cautionary anecdote. The first is status quo bias, our tendency to prefer things staying the way they are, even when the evidence says change is coming. The second is loss aversion, the well-documented finding that people feel the pain of a loss more sharply than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. For Kodak's leadership, killing the film business early would have felt like an immediate, visible loss. The digital upside was uncertain, distant, and split among a market that didn't exist yet. Loss aversion made the defensive choice feel safer, even though it wasn't. The third concept is escalation of commitment, sometimes called the sunk cost fallacy, where an organization keeps pouring resources into an existing path because of what's already been invested in it, rather than assessing the path fresh. Kodak had decades of infrastructure, expertise, factories, supplier relationships, and institutional identity built around film. Walking away from that wasn't just a strategy shift. It was an admission that a huge portion of the company's accumulated expertise was about to become far less valuable. That's a hard thing for any organization or any person to accept quickly. There's a fourth piece, and it's the one Clayton Christensen actually built his research career around. Christensen's work describes something called the resource allocation process, the internal system by which companies decide where money, talent, and attention go. In most large companies, that process is optimized to serve existing profitable customers extremely well. Proposals that promise to grow the current profitable business get funded fast. Proposals that threaten to shrink it, even if they represent the future, get starved of resources, delayed, or quietly deprioritized, not because anyone made an obviously bad decision, but because the system is built to reward what's already working. There's a related concept worth naming too, the principal-agent problem, which shows up constantly in large organizations. The people making day-to-day resource decisions, the managers and division heads, aren't the same as the people who own the long-term outcome, the shareholders or the founders of the company. A division manager whose bonus is tied to this year's film revenue has every reason to protect film this year, even if abandoning it sooner would be better for the company a decade out. That manager isn't behaving badly. They're behaving exactly as their compensation structure tells them to. Multiply that single manager by every layer of a large organization, and you get a company that, in aggregate, behaves far more conservatively than any individual person inside it would say they intend to. It's also worth understanding the broader theory Christensen was building toward, because innovator's dilemma gets used loosely, and the actual argument is sharper than the phrase alone suggests. Christensen distinguished between sustaining innovations, improvements that make an existing product better for existing customers, and disruptive innovations, which tend to be worse than the current product at first, along the dimensions existing customers care about most, but which open up a completely different value proposition. Kodak's film business was extremely good at sustaining innovation, better film, better processing, better color. Early digital cameras were worse than film in almost every way that mattered to Kodak's existing customers at the time. Lower resolution, higher cost per image, clunkier to use. That's exactly why a well-run, customer-focused company would rationally deprioritize it. The theory's uncomfortable conclusion is that listening carefully to your best current customers, usually excellent business practice, is precisely what causes a company to underinvest in the technology that will eventually replace its entire market. It's worth pausing here to imagine how this plays out in a workplace that has nothing to do with cameras or film, because this dynamic shows up constantly in ordinary companies, and recognizing the pattern is more useful than just remembering the Kodak story. Imagine a software company that sells expensive, on-premise licenses to large enterprise customers. A team inside that company builds a cheaper, simpler cloud version of the product. Leadership is intrigued, but cautious, because the cloud product is priced far lower than the licenses that currently fund the whole business. Sales leadership worries about the cloud product cannibalizing existing deals. The cloud team gets a modest budget, a small headcount, and a mandate to keep exploring rather than a mandate to actually win. Years later, a competitor with no legacy licensing revenue to protect builds a similar cloud product, prices it aggressively, and takes the market. The original company wasn't blind to the opportunity. It simply couldn't fund it as aggressively as a company with nothing to lose could. Or imagine a retail chain with a large, well-trained, in-store sales staff, earning commissions tied to in-person purchases. E-commerce starts growing. Leadership sees it clearly, but every dollar shifted online is a dollar that doesn't generate an in-store commission, and store managers, understandably, aren't eager to push customers toward a channel that quietly reduces their team's paychecks. The company builds a website, technically, but it's underfunded, understaffed, and treated as a side project for years, while online-only competitors, with no commission structure to protect, build a faster, cheaper, more convenient experience and simply take the customer relationship. Neither of these hypothetical companies employed foolish people. They employed people responding rationally to the incentives actually in front of them. A third version of the same pattern shows up in manufacturing. Picture a factory that has spent years building deep expertise and deep relationships around a particular manual production process, with skilled workers who take real pride in it. An automated approach becomes available, cheaper and faster, but adopting it in a real way would eventually shrink the very department that currently runs the plant. The manager overseeing that department isn't going to champion the thing that shrinks their own team, not out of malice, but because nobody rewards that kind of self-erasure. So automation gets piloted quietly, in a corner, at small scale, described as still early, for years longer than the technology itself actually justifies. A competitor with a newer factory and no legacy workforce to protect adopts it fully and undercuts on cost within a few years. Once again, nobody involved was foolish. Everyone was responding to what their role rewarded them for protecting. That's the deeper, more useful version of the Kodak lesson. The people involved weren't incompetent. Nobody sat in a room and said, "Let's deliberately ignore the future." Individually, every decision made sense, given what each person was measured on that quarter. Collectively, those individually rational decisions added up to institutional paralysis. Back to the actual history. By the time digital cameras became mainstream consumer products in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the market had shifted dramatically, and this is the part of the story that nobody expects going in. Competitors without Kodak's legacy film business had no reason to hesitate, because they had no profitable existing business to protect. There was no internal faction lobbying to slow-walk the digital transition, because there was no film division whose revenue depended on digital staying small. These competitors moved faster, priced more aggressively, and iterated on the technology, with none of Kodak's internal conflict of interest working against them. Kodak eventually did release digital cameras. The company wasn't asleep, and it wasn't run by people who refused to adapt. But it did so years behind companies that had never carried the weight of a legacy business to protect. And in a fast-moving consumer technology market, a multi-year head start given away to competitors is extraordinarily difficult to claw back. By the time Kodak was competing seriously in digital, the market had already sorted its winners and losers, and Kodak was fighting from behind in a game its own invention had started. Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2012, undone largely by a technology its own engineer invented decades earlier. Sit with that fact for a moment, because it's genuinely strange when you say it plainly. This wasn't a company that got blindsided by an outside disruptor nobody saw coming. This was a company that invented the disruption itself, patented pieces of it, showed it to leadership, and then spent decades managing it as a threat to be contained rather than an opportunity to be seized. Business schools now teach this case specifically as a cautionary example of the innovator's dilemma, a term coined by Clayton Christensen describing exactly this trap, where a company's most profitable existing product becomes the reason it can't seriously pursue the technology that will eventually replace it. It's become one of the most cited business school cases precisely because it isn't a story about a bad leader or a dumb mistake. It's a story about a well-run company doing exactly what its internal incentives told it to do, and still losing. For managers, the lesson isn't just about foresight. Plenty of Kodak's leaders had foresight. Sasson's prototype existed decades before the crisis hit. The real lesson is that internal incentives built around protecting today's profit margin can quietly sabotage a company's own best future idea, even when that idea was invented in-house, championed by your own people, and sitting in a lab down the hall the entire time. So, what does a manager actually do with that? A few concrete things, beyond the general moral of watch out for disruption, which is true but not very actionable on its own. First, separate the budget of anything genuinely new from the budget of what already works. If a promising idea has to compete for funding against your most profitable existing product using the same short-term metrics, it will lose that competition almost every time, even when it's the better long-term bet. Give new ideas their own small, protected resource pool and their own separate success metrics, at least early on. Second, actively go looking for what's being quietly slow-walked inside your own team or company right now. It rarely announces itself as sabotage. It shows up as reasonable-sounding caution, as let's keep exploring, as a modest budget and no real deadline. Ask which projects have been still exploring for over a year, and ask honestly why. Third, build a real channel for people below you to escalate ideas that threaten the current model, without that idea being quietly buried by the manager whose job depends on the current model succeeding. Sasson showed his invention to the people whose paychecks depended on film. Of course, it made them nervous. A manager serious about avoiding this trap needs a path for disruptive ideas that doesn't run entirely through the people most threatened by them. Fourth, and maybe most importantly, get comfortable with the idea that your own team's best future idea might make some part of your current results look worse in the short term. That discomfort is normal. It's also exactly the signal Kodak's leadership felt and chose to manage away rather than act on. Fifth, revisit your resource allocation process itself at least once a year and ask it a blunt question. If the next Steven Sasson walked in today with a prototype that threatened your best product, would your current process fund it or quietly bury it? If you're honest and the answer is bury it, that's the process to fix, not the employee to blame. Here's my own take on why this story keeps getting told decades later in business schools and boardrooms. It's not really a warning about cameras or even about technology. It's a warning about what happens inside any organization, in any industry, when the system quietly rewards protecting what already works over building what comes next. That tension exists in your company right now, whether or not anyone said it out loud. Somewhere inside your own team, there's probably a version of Steven Sasson's prototype sitting in a drawer, patented defensively, or funded just enough to keep someone quiet, waiting for a manager willing to actually back it before someone outside the building does it first. Follow for the psychology behind how teams actually work.